For 39 years, Margaret Maggie Wilson never missed watching a Chicago Bulls game. Through blizzards and blackouts, through joy and heartbreak, the 83-year-old South Side resident kept her perfect streak alive, until a heart condition forced her to miss her first game ever. What began as a small newspaper article about her dedication caught the attention of someone special. When Michael Jordan himself walked into her hospital room, Maggie was indeed speechless, but neither she nor Jordan could have predicted how. Their meeting would unveil a connection between them that had existed for decades without her knowledge. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories happen to ordinary people who simply love something with their whole heart. Margaret Maggie Wilson adjusted her Red Bulls sweater and settled into her worn armchair. At 83, her movements were slower than they used to be, but on game days, she moved with purpose. The television, an older model she refused to replace, was already tuned to the pre-game show. "Almost time," she mumbled to herself, glancing at the clock. 7:28 p.m. 2 minutes until tip-off. Maggie's small apartment on Chicago's South Side was a shrine to her beloved Bulls. Newspaper clippings from championship wins covered nearly every inch of her living room walls. Shelves displayed miniature basketballs, bobbleheads, and rally towels collected over decades. But in the center of her Bulls altar sat her most prized possession, an unworn Bulls cap kept in perfect condition inside a clear plastic box. She'd bought it during Michael Jordan's rookie season, saving it for the day she might get it signed by the great number 23 himself. She reached for her game day notepad, flipping to a fresh page. For 39 years, Maggie had recorded points, rebounds, and her own observations during every Bulls game. Her handwriting had grown shakier over the years, but her basketball mind remained razor-sharp. The doorbell rang just as the players were being announced. "It's open, Tanya," Maggie called, not taking her eyes off the screen. Her granddaughter, Tanya, stepped in, carrying a paper bag that smelled of burgers and fries. "Game day dinner delivery," Tanya said, kissing Maggie's cheek. "Who are they playing tonight?" "The Knicks," Maggie answered, accepting the food with a nod of thanks. "And don't you be acting like you don't know. Your daddy raised you better than that." Tanya laughed, settling on the couch. At 35, she had grown up watching Bulls games with her grandmother. It had become their special bond, especially after Tanya's parents had moved to Arizona for work when she was 12. Maggie had helped raise her, and basketball had been their language. "I was testing you, Grandma, making sure that memory of yours is still working." "Humph. I can tell you what the starting lineup was in '93, but I can't remember where I put my glasses half the time." Maggie tapped her head. "Funny how that works." The game began, and Maggie leaned forward, notepad ready. Tanya watched her grandmother more than the game. She'd seen this ritual hundreds of times, Maggie completely focused, occasionally muttering instructions to players who couldn't hear her. "Oh, come on! That was a clean block!" Maggie shouted at the TV as the referee called a foul. She scribbled something in her notepad, shaking her head. During a commercial break, Tanya got up to make tea. Her eyes fell on a frame on the kitchen counter, a photo of her grandfather Earl and Maggie, both wearing Bulls jerseys, arms around each other at what looked like the old Chicago Stadium. "You miss him on game days, don't you?" Tanya asked softly when she returned. Maggie didn't take her eyes off the screen, but her voice softened. "Every single one. Your grandpa took me to my first Bulls game back in '84. I thought it was the most boring thing I'd ever seen." She chuckled. Then, this skinny rookie named Michael Jordan stepped on the court, and suddenly, I got what Earl had been trying to show me for years. "And you never missed a game after that?" "Not a single one. Even when Earl was in the hospital that last year, we watched together. The nurses would get mad because he'd yell at the TV and disturb the other patients. Maggie smiled at the memory. When he passed, keeping up with every game just seemed like the right way to honor him. The Bulls scored, and both women cheered. Outside, the city lights twinkled against the darkening sky. Inside, time seemed to stand still in Maggie's apartment, a place where memories lived in championship banners and faded ticket stubs. "You know," Tanya said during halftime, "most people your age have different hobbies. Knitting, bingo, book clubs." Maggie snorted. "Sounds boring as dirt. Give me a fast break and a slam dunk any day." Tanya laughed, helping herself to one of Maggie's fries. "The other day at work, I mentioned that my 83-year-old grandmother can name every player who's worn a Bulls jersey since the 80s. Nobody believed me." "Their loss," Maggie said with a shrug. She pointed to a framed newspaper on the wall. "Hand me that one, would you?" Tanya carefully took down the frame. Inside was a yellowed Chicago Tribune from June 15, 1998. The headline read, "Bulls win 6th title." "Best day of my life, basketball-wise," Maggie said, tracing the glass over Jordan's celebrating face. "Earl and I had nosebleed seats. Couldn't see much, but we were there. That's what mattered." The second half began, and they fell back into their routine. Maggie taking notes, Tanya watching her grandmother's joy. As the final seconds ticked down on a Bulls victory, Maggie set down her notepad with satisfaction. Another game watched from start to finish. Another link in the chain that connected her to Earl, to the past, to the players who never knew their biggest fan was an elderly woman who never missed a moment. "Same time tomorrow?" Tanya asked, standing to leave. "Where else would I be?" Maggie replied, carefully adding the night's score to her record book. "Been here for over 3,000 games, planning on at least 1,000 more." Neither of them could have known then how the next game would change everything. Neither of them could have known then how the next game would change everything. The morning after the Bulls' victory, Maggie woke early as she always did. Her joints protested as she shuffled to the kitchen to make her morning coffee. While the pot brewed, she pulled out her special box from the hallway closet. The wooden box, handmade by Earl 30 years ago, held her most precious Bulls memories. Maggie carefully lifted the lid and pulled out a stack of ticket stubs held together with a rubber band. Each one represented a moment frozen in time, a game she and Earl had attended together. "Morning, Earl," she said to the photo of her husband she kept on the kitchen counter. "Bulls looked good last night. That new point guard reminds me of B.J. Armstrong, don't you think?" Talking to Earl's photo had become part of her daily routine in the 15 years since his passing. Some might have found it odd, but to Maggie, basketball and Earl were so intertwined that discussing one without the other felt impossible. She sipped her coffee and thumbed through the ticket stubs until she found the one from their first game together. November 12, 1984, Michael Jordan's rookie season. The ticket was faded now, but she remembered that day as clearly as if it were yesterday. "I don't see why we had to spend our money on this," Maggie had complained, pulling her coat tighter against the November chill as they walked toward Chicago Stadium. Earl had simply smiled, squeezing her hand. "Trust me, Maggie girl. This Jordan kid is something special. Mark my words." Maggie had rolled her eyes, but followed her husband into the noisy arena. The seats were terrible. So high up, they could barely see the players' numbers. But Earl's excitement was contagious. By halftime, Maggie found herself cheering alongside him. When Jordan executed a move that had the whole stadium on its feet, Earl turned to her with eyes wide with wonder. "Did you see that? Did you see what he just did?" And somehow, in that moment, watching her husband's pure joy, something clicked for Maggie. This wasn't just about basketball. It was about passion, about finding something that made you feel alive. After that first game, Maggie started asking questions. She wanted to understand what made Earl love this game so much. He taught her about zone defense and pick and rolls. They started watching games together on TV when they couldn't afford tickets. By the time the Bulls won their first championship in 1991, Maggie wasn't just watching for Earl anymore. She was a true fan in her own right. The doorbell's chime pulled Maggie from her memories. She carefully returned the ticket stubs to the wooden box and went to answer the door. "Mrs. Wilson, I thought you might be awake." It was Danny, the 12-year-old from upstairs. He held a basketball under one arm. "Did you see that three-pointer in the fourth quarter last night?" Maggie smiled, opening the door wider. "Come on in, Danny. I've got some breakfast rolls in the oven." Danny was the grandson of her neighbor Gloria. He had discovered Maggie's basketball obsession last year when helping her carry groceries. Since then, he often stopped by to discuss games. "So what did you think about the defense in the second quarter?" Danny asked, settling at her small kitchen table. "Coach should have called a timeout way earlier." Maggie nodded, placing a cinnamon roll in front of the boy. "That's exactly what I wrote in my letter." "You still writing letters to the team?" Danny asked, mouth full of pastry. "Every big game." Maggie pointed to an envelope on her counter, already addressed to the Bulls training facility. "Been doing it since '92. And they never write back?" Maggie shrugged. "That's not why I do it. Your generation has your Twitter and whatnot. I've got my letters." What she didn't tell Danny was how, after each important game, she carefully composed a letter offering encouragement, and sometimes her thoughts on plays or defensive strategies. She addressed them to the Chicago Bulls team and coaching staff, never expecting them to be read, but feeling better for having sent them. After Danny left for school, Maggie spent the morning cleaning her collection of Bulls memorabilia. She dusted the row of bobbleheads on her shelf, straightened framed newspaper clippings, and polished the glass case that held her unworn Bulls cap. When Tanya called around noon, Maggie was in the middle of organizing her game day notebooks. "Just checking that we're still on for tomorrow's game," Tanya said. "Of course we are. Why wouldn't we be?" There was a pause on the line. "Mom said you canceled your doctor's appointment again." Maggie sighed. Her daughter Linda, Tanya's mother, worried too much. "It was just a checkup. Nothing important." "Grandma, your blood pressure." "Is fine," Maggie interrupted. "Been taking my pills just like I'm supposed to." Another pause. "Are you sure?" "Because Mom said, your mother is in Phoenix. I'm right here in Chicago. I think I know better what's happening in my own apartment." Tanya didn't sound convinced, but she dropped the subject. "Anyway, I'll bring pizza tomorrow. The game starts at 7, right?" 6:30, Maggie corrected. "It's a special night. They're honoring the '96 team at halftime." After hanging up, Maggie felt a twinge of guilt about the pills. The truth was, she had been skipping doses. They made her drowsy, and she couldn't risk falling asleep during games. That afternoon, as she walked to the corner store for milk, Maggie felt a bit dizzy. She steadied herself against a lamppost, waiting for the feeling to pass. It was probably nothing. Just stood up too fast, she told herself. By evening, the dizziness had returned, along with a dull ache in her chest. Maggie ignored it, focusing instead on preparing the envelopes for her latest letter to the Bulls. She'd drop it in the mailbox tomorrow after the game. As she sealed the envelope, she noticed her hand trembling slightly. "Just old age catching up," she muttered to herself. That night, as she climbed into bed, Maggie glanced at her calendar where the next Bulls game was circled in red. Little did she know that the game she had been looking forward to would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would test her devotion like never before. Little did she know that the game she had been looking forward to would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would test her devotion like never before. Game day arrived with a burst of excitement across Chicago. The '96 team reunion had made headlines, and fans were buzzing about seeing some of the legends back on the court for a special halftime ceremony. Maggie woke feeling worse than the day before. The dizziness came in waves now, and the pain in her chest had settled into a constant, dull ache. She took a deep breath and forced herself out of bed. Just nerves, she told herself. Big game today. By the time Tanya arrived with pizza at 6 o'clock, Maggie had put on her Lucky Bulls sweater and arranged her notepad and pen on the side table. She'd applied a bit more makeup than usual to hide the paleness in her cheeks. "You look tired, Grandma," Tanya said, setting down the pizza box. "Did you sleep okay?" "Fine, fine." Maggie waved away the concern. "Just excited about tonight." Tanya didn't look convinced. She glanced around the apartment and spotted the pill bottles on the kitchen counter. Picking one up, she frowned. "This is still full," she said. "Grandma, have you been taking your medication?" Maggie busied herself with plates and napkins. "Some days, I forget. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal." Tanya opened the medicine cabinet in the bathroom and found more unopened bottles. When she returned to the living room, her expression had darkened. "I found your appointment card. You've missed 3 checkups in the last 2 months." Maggie sank into her armchair. "They always schedule them during games." "Then reschedule them." Tanya's voice rose. "These aren't optional, Grandma. Your heart—" "My heart is just fine," Maggie interrupted, pointing to the TV. "The pre-game show is starting. Can we please just enjoy this?" Tanya looked like she wanted to argue more, but instead sat down with a sigh. They ate pizza in silence as the commentators discussed the upcoming game and the halftime celebration. When the game finally began, Maggie leaned forward eagerly, forgetting her discomfort. The Bulls started strong, building a 10-point lead in the first quarter. Maggie cheered and took notes, her face animated with excitement. During a timeout in the second quarter, the pain in Maggie's chest suddenly intensified. She gasped and pressed her hand against her sternum. "Grandma!" Tanya was instantly at her side. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Maggie managed, though her face had gone pale. "Just heartburn from the pizza." "That's not heartburn. I'm calling an ambulance." "No!" Maggie grabbed Tanya's arm with surprising strength. "Not during the game. Please, Tanya. This is important to me." "More important than your life?" Tanya's eyes filled with tears. Maggie's gaze drifted to Earl's photo on the wall, then to the unworn Bulls cap in its case. "Give me until the end of the game. If I'm still feeling bad, then you can take me to the hospital yourself." Tanya hesitated, then reluctantly agreed. "Fine, but you take your pills right now, and if you get any worse, we're leaving, game or no game." Maggie nodded, swallowing the pills Tanya handed her. The pain eased slightly, and she managed to focus on the rest of the game. The Bulls won by 3 points in a nail-biting finish that had both women on their feet cheering. As the excitement faded, however, the pain returned. Maggie couldn't hide her wincing as she tried to stand. "That's it," Tanya said firmly. "We're going to the hospital. Now!" This time, Maggie didn't argue. The emergency room was busy, but Maggie's symptoms got her seen quickly. After tests and examinations, a doctor with kind eyes and gray hair entered their curtained area. "Mrs. Wilson," he said gently, "your EKG shows some concerning patterns, and your blood pressure is much too high." "What does that mean?" Tanya asked, holding her grandmother's hand. It means we need to run more tests, and Mrs. Wilson needs to stay with us tonight." He looked at Maggie directly. "Have you been taking your medication regularly?" Maggie looked down at her hands. "Not as regularly as I should." The doctor nodded, unsurprised. "Well, we're going to get you stabilized, but I'm concerned about your heart. We may need to consider a procedure to improve blood flow." "A procedure?" Maggie repeated. "Like surgery?" "Possibly. We'll know more tomorrow after we complete the tests." After the doctor left, Tanya stepped out to call her mother. Alone in the hospital room, Maggie felt fear creeping in for the first time. Not fear of surgery or even death, but fear of breaking her streak. There was another Bulls game in 3 days, an important one against their rivals. She had never missed watching a game in 39 years. When Tanya returned, Maggie asked shakily, "When would this surgery be?" "They'll tell us tomorrow, Grandma." "Don't worry about that now." "But the game on Thursday!" Tanya stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? You're in the hospital with heart problems, and you're worried about a basketball game?" Seeing the hurt in her granddaughter's eyes, Maggie fell silent. But inside, her mind was already calculating how she might convince the hospital staff to let her watch the game from her bed. What she didn't know yet was that the doctor would return the next morning with news that would shatter her perfect attendance record once and for all. What she didn't know yet was that the doctor would return the next morning with news that would shatter her perfect attendance record once and for all. Maggie barely slept that night. The hospital bed felt wrong, too flat, too sterile, nothing, like her worn armchair where she'd watched thousands of Bulls games. The beeping of machines replaced the familiar sounds of sneakers squeaking on hardwood and the roar of the crowd after a slam dunk. Tanya had gone home around midnight, promising to return first thing in the morning. In the quiet darkness, Maggie's thoughts drifted to Earl. What would he say about her being here? Probably that she was stubborn as a mule for skipping her medication. He'd always been the sensible one. When Dr. Reynolds entered her room the next morning, Maggie was already awake, picking at a breakfast she had no appetite for. Tanya sat in a chair beside the bed, scrolling through her phone. "Good morning, Mrs. Wilson," the doctor said, flipping through her chart. "How are you feeling today?" "Ready to go home," Maggie replied firmly. Dr. Reynolds pulled up a chair. "I'm afraid that won't be possible just yet. The test results confirm what we suspected. You have several blocked arteries that are restricting blood flow to your heart." Tanya reached for Maggie's hand. "What does that mean, doctor?" "It means Mrs. Wilson needs a procedure called an angioplasty. We'll insert a small balloon to open up the blocked arteries and probably place stents to keep them open." Maggie frowned. "How long will that take? An hour? 2? "The procedure itself takes 1 to 2 hours, Doctor," Reynolds explained, "but you'll need time to recover afterward. We're looking at a hospital stay of at least 3 to 4 days." 3 to 4 days? Maggie's voice rose. "But the game against Boston is Thursday night." The doctor looked confused, and Tanya quickly explained, "My grandmother hasn't missed watching a Bulls game since 1984. "I see," Dr. Reynolds nodded, understanding now. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson, but your health has to come first. We need to do this procedure as soon as possible, which means tomorrow morning." Maggie's face fell. "Can't you do it Friday instead? After the game?" "Grandma, please," Tanya said gently. "This is serious." Dr. Reynolds checked his schedule. "The surgical team is booked Friday. Our next opening would be Monday, but I strongly advise against waiting that long. The risk of a major heart attack increases every day we delay." Maggie stared out the window, tears welling in her eyes. Almost 4 decades of never missing a game. Through blizzards, power outages, even Earl's funeral, They'd postponed it by a day at her insistence. And now it would end because of her own foolishness in not taking care of herself. "Fine," she finally whispered. "Tomorrow." After the doctor left, Tanya tried to comfort her. "It's just one game, Grandma. You can watch the highlights afterward." Maggie shook her head. "It's not the same. You don't understand what this streak means to me." "Then help me understand," Tanya said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Maggie was quiet for a long moment. "It's my connection to Earl," she finally said. "It's like, as long as I keep watching every game, a part of him is still here with me." Her voice broke. "I know it sounds silly." "It's not silly at all," Tanya assured her, blinking back tears of her own. Later that afternoon, a nurse named Jessie came in to check Maggie's vitals. As she worked, she chatted amiably about her day. "My brother-in-law works for the Tribune," she mentioned. "He's always looking for human interest stories. I told him about you. Hope you don't mind. A Bulls fan who hasn't missed a game since the '80s? That's pretty amazing." Maggie shrugged, still feeling defeated. "He might stop by tomorrow after your procedure," Jessie continued. "Just for a quick interview if you're feeling up to it." Tanya perked up. "That's a great idea. Maybe if people hear about my grandmother's dedication, someone from the Bulls organization might reach out." Maggie didn't share her enthusiasm. What did it matter now? The streak would be broken either way. That evening, Tanya brought in a small portable radio. "I know it's not the same as watching, but you can at least listen to the game tomorrow while you recover." "They don't allow radios in the recovery room," Maggie said flatly. "I already asked." The next morning, Maggie was prepped for surgery. As they wheeled her toward the operating room, she clutched Tanya's hand. "Record it for me," she said urgently. "Every minute, even the commercials." "I will, Grandma. I promise." As the anesthesia took effect, Maggie's last conscious thought was of the Chicago Stadium in 1984, Earl's hand holding hers as they watched a rookie named Michael Jordan soar through the air for the first time. The procedure went well. By evening, Maggie was groggy but stable in the recovery room. Tanya sat beside her, phone in hand, watching the Bulls-Celtics game with the volume turned down low. "Don't tell me the score," Maggie mumbled, drifting in and out of sleep. "I want to watch it later, without knowing." The next morning, a young man with a press badge appeared at her door. "Mrs. Wilson? I'm Kevin Daniels from the Chicago Tribune. My sister-in-law Jessie told me about your incredible Bulls streak. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Despite feeling weak, Maggie agreed. As they talked, Kevin's eyes grew wider with each story she shared. 39 years, without missing a game, he repeated, scribbling in his notebook. "Until yesterday?" "Until yesterday," Maggie confirmed, trying to keep the sadness from her voice. Kevin left, promising that his article would appear in the weekend edition. Maggie didn't expect much to come of it. After all, she was just one fan among millions. What made her special now that her streak was broken? She couldn't have known that. The small newspaper story would find its way to someone who understood perfectly what it meant to never give up. Someone whose visit would change everything. She couldn't have known that the small newspaper story would find its way to someone who understood perfectly what it meant to never give up. Someone whose visit would change everything. The days following Maggie's surgery passed slowly. The PE doctors were pleased with her recovery, but she felt a hollowness that had nothing to do with her physical health. Thursday night had come and gone. For the first time since 1984, a Bulls game had been played without Maggie Wilson watching. "You're making excellent progress, Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Reynolds said during his morning rounds on Saturday. "If things continue this way, You might be able to go home Monday or Tuesday." Maggie nodded, but her enthusiasm was muted. "Thank you, doctor." After he left, Tanya arrived carrying a tote bag and the morning edition of the Chicago Tribune. "You made the paper, Grandma," she announced, holding up the newspaper. Maggie squinted at the small article near the bottom of the sports section. The headline read, "The Bulls' Most Faithful Fan. 39-year streak ends with health scare." "They made me sound ancient," Maggie grumbled after scanning the article. "They made you sound dedicated," Tanya corrected, unpacking the tote bag. "I brought some things to make this place feel more like home." She began placing framed photos around the sterile hospital room, Earl in his Bulls jersey, Maggie at her 80th birthday wearing a Bulls cap, the two of them with a much younger Tanya at a game. Last, she carefully set Maggie's prized possession, the unworn Bulls cap in its protective case, on the bedside table. "There," Tanya said, stepping back to survey her work. "A little bit of Bulls spirit in here now." Maggie's eyes welled with tears. "Thank you, honey." That afternoon, a steady stream of get-well cards began arriving. Neighbors, church friends, and even Danny from upstairs had sent messages of support. One card was signed by the entire staff of the coffee shop where Maggie stopped every Tuesday for her weekly treat. "Look how many people care about you," Tanya said, arranging the cards on the windowsill. Maggie was touched, but the gnawing emptiness remained. She kept glancing at the clock, aware that another Bulls game would start in just a few hours. Another game she would miss. Sunday morning brought more visitors. Gloria, Danny's grandmother, brought homemade banana bread. Pastor Williams from Maggie's church stopped by after services with flowers and prayers. Even Kevin from the Tribune returned, pleased to tell her that he'd received positive feedback about his article. "People are inspired by your dedication, Mrs. Wilson," he said. "My editor wants me to do a follow-up piece once you're back home." After he left, Maggie's nurse, Jessie, came in with a curious expression. "You're becoming quite the celebrity around here," she said, checking Maggie's vitals. "The switchboard got a call asking about you this morning." "Probably another church member," Maggie said. Jessie shook her head. "The caller said they were from the Bulls Community Relations office. They wanted to know how you were doing." Maggie's eyes widened. "The Bulls? Called about me?" "That's what they said. Probably saw Kevin's article." For the first time since her surgery, a genuine smile spread across Maggie's face. The Bulls, her Bulls, had noticed her. Monday morning, Maggie felt stronger. She managed to walk the length of the hallway twice with Tanya's help. Dr. Reynolds was so pleased with her progress that he scheduled her discharge for Wednesday. "Just a couple more days of observation to make sure everything's stable," he explained. That afternoon, while Tanya had stepped out to make some calls, a hospital administrator Maggie hadn't seen before knocked on her door. "Mrs. Wilson? I'm Thomas Grayson, Assistant Director of Patient Services." The man in the crisp suit seemed unusually formal compared to the other staff she'd met. "I wanted to check on your accommodations. Is everything satisfactory?" "It's a hospital, not the Ritz," Maggie replied with a shrug. "But everyone's been very kind." Mr. Grayson nodded, making notes on his tablet. "I see you're scheduled for discharge on Wednesday. How would you feel about moving to a private room on our VIP floor for your final 2 nights with us?" Maggie frowned. "I don't have that kind of insurance coverage." "There would be no additional charge," Mr. Grayson assured her quickly. "We occasionally have special circumstances that allow us to upgrade patients." "What special circumstances?" Maggie asked suspiciously. The administrator shifted uncomfortably. "We've received some inquiries about your care from interested parties. Because of that newspaper article? That's silly. Nevertheless, Mr. Grayson continued, we have a larger private room available with better amenities. A bigger television, for one thing. He glanced meaningfully at the small TV mounted on the wall. I understand you're quite the basketball fan. Maggie narrowed her eyes. What's really going on here, Mr. Grayson? Before he could answer, Tanya returned. Mr. Grayson quickly explained the room upgrade offered to her. That sounds wonderful, Tanya said, giving Maggie a pointed look. Isn't that nice of them, Grandma? I suppose, Maggie conceded reluctantly. As long as there's really no extra charge. None whatsoever, Mr. Grayson promised. We can move you first thing tomorrow morning. After he left, Maggie turned to Tanya. Something fishy is going on. Hospitals don't just give away fancy rooms. Maybe they really were touched by your story, Tanya suggested, though she didn't sound convinced either. That evening, as Tanya was preparing to leave, her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She stepped into the hallway to answer it. When she returned a few minutes later, her expression was unreadable. Who was that? Maggie asked. Just someone about work, Tanya said vaguely. Nothing important. But Maggie had raised this girl and knew when she was hiding something. Tanya Marie, you're a terrible liar. Always have been since you were little. What's going on? Tanya hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. I'm not supposed to say anything, I promised. Promised who? I can't tell you that either. Tanya squeezed her grandmother's hand. Just trust me, okay? Accept the room change and don't ask too many questions for now. Maggie studied her granddaughter's face. There was excitement behind Tanya's eyes that she was trying hard to contain. This has something to do with the Bulls, doesn't it? Maggie guessed. Are they sending me a gift basket or something? Tanya stood up, gathering her purse. I should go. It's getting late. She kissed Maggie's cheek. I'll be here first thing tomorrow to help with the move. Just try to rest and don't worry about anything, okay? After Tanya left, Maggie lay awake in the darkened room. First the call from the Bulls' office, then the mysterious room upgrade, and now Tanya's strange behavior. Something was definitely happening. As Tolitsevant, she drifted off to sleep. Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring something unexpected. She just hoped it would be good news. Heaven knows she could use some after breaking her perfect streak. What she couldn't possibly imagine was just how life-changing the next few days would be, or who would soon be walking through her hospital room door. What she couldn't possibly imagine was just how life-changing the next few days would be, or who would soon be walking through her hospital room door. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual activity. Two nurses Maggie hadn't seen before came to help her prepare for the move. They seemed oddly attentive, fussing over her hair and offering a fresh hospital gown. The regular one is fine, Maggie insisted, confused by all the attention. We have these new ones for the VIP floor, one nurse explained, holding up a soft blue gown that looked nothing like standard hospital wear. Much more comfortable. By the time Tanya arrived, Maggie was sitting in a wheelchair, her few belongings packed in a hospital tote bag, looking suspicious about the whole affair. Morning, Grandma! Tanya seemed unusually cheerful. Ready for your upgrade? I still don't understand what's happening, Maggie grumbled as an orderly began wheeling her down the hallway. Since when does a newspaper article get you special? Treatment? Tanya just smiled mysteriously. Sometimes good things happen to good people. The elevator took them to the top floor of the hospital. When the doors opened, Maggie immediately noticed the difference. The hallway was carpeted, the lighting softer, and the typical hospital sounds muted. It looked more like a hotel than a medical facility. Her new room was 3 times the size of her previous one, with large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. A flat-screen TV hung on the wall, far bigger than the small unit in her old room. Fresh flowers sat on a side table, and the hospital bed looked more comfortable, with what appeared to be actual linen sheets instead of the standard issue ones. "This is ridiculous," Maggie said, as the orderly helped her into the new bed. "I'm just an old lady who watches basketball." "A very special old lady," Tanya corrected. Arranging Maggie's personal items around the room, she carefully placed the protected Bulls cap on the bedside table. Throughout the day, the special treatment continued. The food was noticeably better. Maggie's lunch arrived on china plates instead of plastic trays. Doctors and nurses checked on her more frequently, and everyone seemed to be smiling a little too brightly. In the afternoon, a maintenance worker came to check the television and adjust the lighting. He spent an unusual amount of time examining the room's layout, measuring distances between furniture, and checking the view from different angles. "Is there something wrong with the room?" Maggie asked him. "No, ma'am," he replied quickly. "Just making sure everything is perfect for your comfort." Later, a hospital administrator, not Mr. Grayson, but someone even higher ranking, stopped by to personally ensure Maggie was satisfied with her accommodations. "Is there anything else we can provide to make your stay more comfortable, Mrs. Wilson?" the woman asked. "Yes," Maggie said firmly. "You can tell me what's really going on." The administrator glanced at Tanya, who subtly shook her head. "We just want to ensure our patients receive the best care possible," the administrator said smoothly. "Especially someone with your profile." "My profile?" Maggie repeated skeptically. "I was a cafeteria worker for 35 years. The only profile I have is my Bulls fan streak, which is broken now anyway." The administrator smiled politely and excused herself. As soon as she left, Maggie turned to Tanya. "All right, young lady, enough secrets. You're going to tell me what's happening, or I'll check myself out of this hospital right now." Tanya sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I can't tell you everything, Grandma. I literally signed papers." "Papers? What kind of papers?" "Non-disclosure agreements." Tanya lowered her voice. "All I can say is that someone important read about you in the paper and wanted to do something nice." "Someone from the Bulls?" Maggie pressed. Tanya neither confirmed nor denied it. "You'll find out tomorrow, and that's all I'm saying." That evening, after Tanya left, a security guard appeared in Maggie's doorway. He wasn't wearing the usual hospital security uniform, but something more professional-looking. "Just doing a routine check, ma'am," he said, glancing around the room before leaving. 10 minutes later, another security person, this one a woman, made the same routine check. Throughout the night, Maggie noticed increased activity in the hallway outside her room. Hospital staff speaking in hushed tones, more security personnel appearing. Someone even came in to vacuum the already clean carpet. The next morning, Maggie woke to find a gift bag on her bedside table. Inside was a brand new Bulls jersey, still with tags attached. "One of the nurses left this for you," the morning aide explained when Maggie asked. "Said it was from the staff." Maggie examined the jersey carefully. Something about it looked different from the ones sold in stores. The stitching was more detailed, the fabric finer. Before she could investigate further, Tanya arrived carrying coffee and bagels. "Big day today, Grandma," she announced cheerfully. "First, let's get you looking your best." To Maggie's surprise, Tanya had brought makeup, Maggie's favorite dress from home, and even her good shoes. "I'm still in the hospital," Maggie pointed out. "Why do I need to get dressed up?" "Doctor's orders," Tanya said, which they both knew was a lie. "He thinks it'll be good for your recovery to feel more like yourself." After Maggie was dressed and her hair styled, something Tanya insisted on, a new doctor Maggie hadn't met before came to examine her. "Your recovery is remarkable, Mrs. Wilson," he said, though he barely looked at her chart. "I think we can move your discharge up to tomorrow morning instead of Friday." As he was leaving, Maggie heard him say to someone in the hallway, "She's cleared for visitors. No health concerns." By noon, the mysterious preparations reached a fever pitch. Someone came to adjust the room's lighting again. Fresh flowers appeared. The hospital director himself stopped by briefly, nodding approvingly at the room's setup. "What time is this supposed visitor coming?" Maggie finally asked Tanya, who hadn't left her side all morning. Tanya checked her watch. "Soon. And remember, no matter what happens, try not to get too excited. Your heart is still healing." "Now I'm really worried," Maggie said, only half joking. At precisely 2 o'clock, Maggie heard a commotion in the hallway. Voices, footsteps, the squawk of security radios. Tanya suddenly stood, taking out her phone as if preparing to record something. "Tanya," Maggie said, her voice shaking slightly. "Who is coming to see me?" Before Tanya could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. The hospital director stepped in first, looking more nervous than Maggie had ever seen a doctor look. "Mrs. Wilson," he said formally, "you have a visitor." The door opened wider, and there, filling the doorway with his unmistakable presence, was a man Maggie had watched for years, but never thought she'd meet. A man whose poster had hung in her living room since 1984. Maggie Wilson's heart seemed to stop as Michael Jordan himself stepped into her hospital room. Maggie Wilson's heart seemed to stop as Michael Jordan himself stepped into her hospital room. For a moment, time stood perfectly still. The basketball legend, older now than in his playing days but unmistakable with his commanding presence, stood just feet away from her bed. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson," he said with a warm smile. "I hear you haven't missed a Bulls game since my rookie year." Maggie's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her hands trembled as she reached for the protected Bulls cap that had sat unworn for nearly 40 years. Jordan noticed the cap, and his smile widened. "Is that from '84? He asked, stepping closer. Finally finding her voice, Maggie whispered, "I bought it the day after your first game. Been saving it all this time." Jordan gently took the case, opened it, and removed the pristine cap. With a pen produced from his pocket, he signed the brim, then carefully placed it on Maggie's head. "Perfect fit," he said. Tears streamed down Maggie's cheeks. "I can't believe you're really here." For the next hour, they talked basketball. Jordan shared stories from the locker room during the championship years. Maggie surprised him with her detailed memory of specific plays from games decades past. Tanya recorded parts of their conversation, her own eyes wet with tears. Before leaving, Jordan handed Maggie an envelope. "The Bulls organization would like to invite you to be our special guest at a charity game next month once you're fully recovered," he explained. "All the living legends will be there. We'd be honored if you'd join us." After he left, Maggie sat in stunned silence, touching the signed cap on her head, as if to convince herself it had really happened. That had been yesterday. Now, with her discharge scheduled for tomorrow morning, Maggie found herself unable to sleep. The events of the past 24 hours seemed like a dream. The night nurse, a kind woman named Patrice, checked in around midnight. "Still awake, Mrs. Wilson? Can I get you anything?" "Just trying to process everything," Maggie replied. Patrice smiled, adjusting Maggie's blankets. "That was quite a visit you had. The whole hospital's talking about it. I've watched every game." "He ever played with the Bulls?" Maggie said softly. "Every single one. I can't believe he came to see me." "Well, Your story touched a lot of people, Patrice replied. That reporter really captured your dedication. After Patrice left, Maggie turned her gaze to the Chicago skyline outside her window. The city sparkled in the night, the same city where she'd lived her entire life. The same city whose basketball team had given her so much joy, and now, this incredible moment. Her thoughts drifted to Earl. What would he have said about today? She could almost hear his laugh, see the twinkle in his eyes. "I told you that Jordan kid was special," he would have said. Maggie smiled at the thought, finally feeling sleepy. As she drifted off, the signed Bulls cap sat on her bedside table, a tangible reminder that sometimes faith and dedication are rewarded in unexpected ways. Morning arrived with a gentle knock at her door. Tanya entered, carrying a paper bag that smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls. "How's the celebrity patient today?" she teased, setting breakfast on the movable table. "Still feels like I dreamed the whole thing," Maggie admitted, reaching for the cap to reassure herself. "Well, the internet sure knows it wasn't a dream," Tanya said, showing Maggie her phone. "Someone from the hospital staff leaked a photo. It's everywhere." Sure enough, there was a slightly blurry image of Jordan sitting beside Maggie's hospital bed, both of them laughing about something. The caption read, "GOAT meets his biggest fan. Michael Jordan visits 83-year-old who never missed a Bulls game." "Oh, my goodness," Maggie murmured, scrolling through the comments. People from around the world were touched by her story. "And that's not all," Tanya continued excitedly. "The Bulls Community Relations Office called this morning. They want to arrange transportation for you to the charity game next month." "A limo, Grandma? They're sending a limo?" Maggie shook her head in wonder. "All because I watched some basketball games." "No," Tanya corrected gently. "Because you showed what it means to be truly dedicated to something you love." Dr. Reynolds arrived for Maggie's final checkup before discharge. "Blood pressure is normal. Incision is healing nicely," he announced after examining her. "But I'm concerned about your excitement levels, Mrs. Wilson. Meeting a basketball legend right after heart surgery isn't exactly what I prescribed for rest and recovery." "It was better than any medicine," Maggie assured him. "Well, just to be safe, I want you to take things easy once you get home," the doctor said sternly. "That means no excitement for at least 2 weeks." Maggie and Tanya exchanged glances. "That might be a problem," Tanya admitted. "There's a Bulls home game tomorrow night," Dr. Reynolds sighed. "I suppose watching on TV is okay, as long as you don't get too worked up. No jumping out of your chair or shouting at the referee." "Doctor's orders," Maggie agreed solemnly, though her eyes twinkled. After he left, a hospital administrator arrived with discharge papers and an unusual request. "Mrs. Wilson, the hospital would like your permission to name our new cardiac rehabilitation wing after you," she explained. "Your story has inspired many of our heart patients." Maggie was speechless for the second time in 2 days. "But I'm nobody special," she protested. "That's where you're wrong," the administrator replied. "Your dedication shows our patients what's possible after recovery." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Nurses stopped by to say goodbye. The security guards who had been ever present during Jordan's visit wished her well. Even Mr. Grayson from Patient Services brought a parting gift: a framed photo of Chicago Stadium, where Maggie and Earl had watched their first Bulls game together. By evening, everything was ready for tomorrow's discharge. Tanya had gone home to prepare Maggie's apartment, promising to return first thing in the morning. Alone in her room, Maggie carefully packed her few belongings. The Bulls jersey she'd received, which she now suspected might be an authentic team-issued one, was folded neatly in her bag. The signed cap remained out, too precious to pack away just yet. As night fell over Chicago, Maggie found herself growing restless. Her hand reached for the remote, turning on the television to catch the sports news. The Bulls had an away game tonight in Detroit, a game she would have moved heaven and earth to watch just a week ago. Strangely, she felt no urgency to watch it now. Something had shifted inside her. The streak was already broken, but instead of disappointment, she felt a curious sense of peace. Perhaps some things were meant to end so that new beginnings could take their place. She turned off the TV without checking the score. Tomorrow, she would go home. Tomorrow, she would begin a new chapter. Not as the woman who never missed a game, but as something more. As she drifted off to sleep, Maggie thought about the charity game next month and the limo that would come to take her there. She thought about Jordan's visit and the kindness he had shown. But most of all, she thought about Earl and how sometimes loving something means letting it change and grow into something you never expected. What Maggie couldn't know was that the biggest surprise was still to come. A revelation at the charity game that would connect her to the Bulls in a way she had never imagined possible. What Maggie couldn't know was that the biggest surprise was still to come. A revelation at the charity game that would connect her to the Bulls in a way she had never imagined possible. The 6 weeks following Maggie's hospital discharge passed in a whirlwind. Her apartment became a revolving door of visitors, neighbors bearing casseroles, church friends stopping by to hear about Jordan's visit, and even a few local reporters hoping for follow-up stories. Tanya stayed with her the first week, making sure Maggie took her medication properly and didn't overexert herself. To everyone's surprise, Maggie followed the doctor's orders without complaint, resting during Bulls games instead of getting worked up about bad calls or missed shots. "You seem different," Tanya observed one evening as they watched a game together, more relaxed about the Bulls winning or losing. Maggie considered this, absently touching the signed cap she now kept in a more secure display case. "I guess meeting your hero changes things. Makes you realize there's more to the game than just the score." By the time the charity game approached, Maggie had fully recovered. Her doctors were impressed with her progress, attributing it to her positive attitude and determination, the same qualities that had kept her watching Bulls games for nearly 4 decades. The morning of the charity game arrived bright and clear. Maggie woke early, too excited to sleep. The event wasn't scheduled until 7 that evening, but she found herself checking the clock every few minutes. When the doorbell rang at noon, she was surprised. The limo wasn't supposed to arrive until 5. "Special delivery for Mrs. Wilson," a courier announced when she opened the door. He handed her a large flat box with the Bulls logo embossed on top. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a custom Bulls jersey with her name on the back and the number 39, representing her years of dedication. A note card read simply, "Wear this tonight." MJ tears sprang to Maggie's eyes as she held the jersey against herself. It was exactly her size. Tanya arrived at 3, carrying a garment bag with a new pair of dressy pants and comfortable shoes for Maggie to wear with the jersey. "The Bulls office called again this morning," Tanya said as she helped Maggie get ready. "They're rolling out the red carpet for you tonight, literally. There's a special entrance and everything." "All this fuss over an old lady," Maggie said, shaking her head in wonder. "Not just any old lady," Tanya corrected. "The Bulls' biggest fan." The limousine arrived precisely at 5, a gleaming black vehicle with a uniformed driver who treated Maggie like royalty. The drive to the United Center took them past Chicago, stadium's old location, now redeveloped but forever special in Maggie's memory. "Earl and I sat in the nosebleed section right over there," she told the driver, pointing out the window. "Cheapest seats in the house, but we didn't care." As they approached the United Center, Maggie gasped. The electronic marquee outside displayed A welcome message. The Chicago Bulls welcome Margaret Wilson, our most faithful fan. Just as Tanya had said, a red carpet led from the car to a private entrance. Staff members lined the pathway, applauding as Maggie emerged from the limo. Flash bulbs popped as photographers captured her arrival. "This way, Mrs. Wilson," a Bulls staff member said, guiding her through the entrance. "Mr. Jordan is waiting to greet you." They led her down corridors normally closed to the public, past framed jerseys of Bulls legends and display cases filled with championship trophies. Tanya followed, filming everything on her phone. Finally, they reached a luxurious suite. When the door opened, Michael Jordan himself stood waiting, along with several other Bulls legends, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, and others Maggie had watched for years. "There she is," Jordan announced with a broad smile. "The woman who never missed a game." The room erupted in applause. Maggie felt her knees weaken slightly, and Jordan stepped forward to offer his arm for support. "We're honored to have you here tonight, Mrs. Wilson," he said, leading her to a comfortable seat in the center of the suite. "These guys have been excited to meet you ever since I told them about your dedication." One by one, the Bulls legends came to introduce themselves, share stories, and sign Maggie's new jersey. She was overwhelmed, but managed to respond to each one, sometimes surprising them with her detailed knowledge of their careers. "You really did watch every game," Pippen marveled after Maggie recalled specific details about a playoff game from 1993. As game time approached, Jordan explained that they had a special seat for her courtside, the best view in the house. "But first," he said, "there's someone else who wanted to meet you." The suite door opened again, and a distinguished-looking older man entered. Though he had aged, Maggie instantly recognized Phil Jackson, the legendary coach who had led the Bulls to 6 championships. "Mrs. Wilson," Jackson said warmly, taking her hand. "I've been looking forward to this moment for a very long time." There was something in his tone that made Maggie pause, a hint of familiarity beyond mere politeness. "Your letters," he continued, his voice softer now. "I kept every one of them." Maggie's eyes widened. "My letters? You actually read them?" Jackson nodded, reaching into his jacket to pull out a worn envelope. "Not just read them. This one from June 1998, right before Game 6 of the finals against Utah. I read it to the entire team." The room had gone quiet, all eyes on them. "You wrote, 'Remember that basketball isn't just about talent. It's about heart, about believing even when the odds are against you.'" Jackson quoted from memory. That message resonated with all of us during a very difficult time. Tears filled Maggie's eyes. All those years, all those letters sent without knowing if they ever reached their destination. And now to learn that not only had they been received, but they had mattered. "Come," Jordan said gently, offering his arm again. "It's almost game time, and Chicago is waiting to meet their most loyal fan." As they led her toward the arena, Maggie felt Earl's presence stronger than ever. "You see that, Earl?" she whispered. "Looks like we made a difference after all." What awaited her in the arena would leave her truly speechless, a revelation so unexpected that it would forever change how she viewed her decades of faithfulness to the Chicago Bulls. What awaited her in the arena would leave her truly speechless, a revelation so unexpected that it would forever change how she viewed her decades of faithfulness to the Chicago Bulls. The noise hit Maggie first as they approached the court, 18,000 fans cheering, the sound echoing throughout the arena. She had only ever experienced this from the upper levels, never from courtside. The difference was staggering. Jordan guided her toward center court, where a single chair draped with a red Bulls blanket awaited. The crowd's cheering intensified as they recognized the basketball legend escorting an elderly woman onto the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed over the speakers. "Please welcome the most dedicated Bulls fan in history, Mrs. Margaret Wilson." The crowd rose to their feet in a thunderous ovation. On the giant screens overhead, Maggie saw herself, small, gray-haired, wide-eyed with wonder, her custom Bulls jersey gleaming under the arena lights. Beside her, the greatest basketball player of all time stood proudly. Mrs. Wilson has watched every Bulls game from 1984 until her recent health scare, the announcer continued. That's over 3,000 games, folks. Through 6 championships, through rebuilding years, through it all, Maggie Wilson never missed a game. More applause washed over her like a wave. Tanya stood nearby, filming everything, tears streaming down her face. Jordan stepped up to a microphone. "I've been lucky enough to meet fans all over the world," he said, "but I've never met anyone with the dedication Maggie has shown to our team. Tonight, we want to honor that dedication." He motioned toward the rafters. A spotlight illuminated a covered banner hanging high above the court. As Maggie watched, the covering fell away to reveal Margaret Maggie Wilson, Bulls' most valuable fan, 1984 forever. It was the same place where the retired jersey numbers of Bulls legends hung, Jordan's 23, Pippen's 33, and others. And now there was a banner for her. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The crowd roared its approval, but Jordan wasn't finished. He turned to Maggie with a mischievous smile. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice softening as he leaned closer to the microphone. "Something about those letters you sent us over the years." Phil Jackson joined them at center court, carrying a binder. He opened it to reveal dozens of Maggie's handwritten letters, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Maggie's letters always included words of encouragement, Jackson explained to the crowd. But what made them special was what came after the encouragement. He selected a letter and held it up. After every tough game, Maggie would include detailed observations about our opponent's strategies. She'd point out defensive weaknesses she noticed, suggest adjustments to our offense. Maggie's eyes widened. She had always included those thoughts, never expecting anyone to take them seriously. "What Maggie doesn't know," Jackson continued, "is that her basketball analysis was exceptional. So good, in fact, that during the 97 and 98 championship runs, I began implementing her suggestions." A murmur of surprise rippled through the arena. The defensive adjustment we made against Utah in Game 6 of the 1998 Finals? That came from one of Maggie's letters. Jackson turned to face her directly. "The zone trap that confused Stockton in the fourth quarter? Your idea, Mrs. Wilson?" Jordan nodded, smiling broadly. "Phil would come to practice and say, 'Maggie thinks we should try this,' and we'd all know exactly who he meant. You became our secret weapon, our unofficial assistant coach." The crowd erupted again, louder than before. On the screens, they showed footage from that historic Game 6, highlighting the defensive strategy that Maggie had suggested in her letter. "The truth is," Jackson said, his voice carrying across the now hushed arena, "some of the most memorable moments in Bulls history happened because this cafeteria worker from the South Side understood basketball in a way few others did." Maggie sat frozen in her seat, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. All those years, all those letters written at her small kitchen table after games, she had never dreamed they were being read, let alone that her suggestions were being implemented by one of the greatest coaches in NBA history. Jordan knelt beside her chair, speaking now just to her, though his words were captured by the microphone. Earl would have been so proud, Maggie. You weren't just watching the games all those years. You were helping us win them. The emotions overwhelmed her. Through her tears, Maggie saw Tanya sobbing openly, saw the legendary players nodding in respect, saw thousands of fans standing in appreciation of a woman they had never known existed until a few weeks ago. As the reality sank in, something settled. In Maggie's heart, a sense of completion, of purpose fulfilled. She had never missed a game because deep down she had felt connected to the team in some inexplicable way. Now she understood why. She hadn't just been a fan watching from afar. In her own small way, through her carefully written letters filled with basketball insights, Maggie Wilson had been part of the Chicago Bulls all along. "Thank you," she whispered, too soft for anyone but Jordan to hear. "Thank you for letting me be part of something so special." The night continued with the charity game, but for Maggie, the world had already changed forever. The broken streak no longer mattered. What mattered was the realization that her dedication had never gone unnoticed and had made more of a difference than she could have ever imagined. The night continued with the charity game, but for Maggie, the world had already changed forever. The broken streak no longer mattered. What mattered was the realization that her dedication had never gone unnoticed and had made more of a difference than she could have ever imagined. 6 months later, United Center buzzed with excitement. The Bulls had made the playoffs for the first time in years. In a special box sat Maggie Wilson, surrounded by family. She wore her custom jersey proudly, the signed cap perched on her head. Below, on the Bulls bench, sat a new addition to the coaching staff, a special fan consultant, whose job was to review strategy from a fan's perspective.